Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel, and today I want to share with you my all-time favorite books. In my last two videos, I shared with you some of my favorite books in general, and while I love each and every one of those, these are my absolute favorite books of all time. All of these are series, by the way, so I suppose it would be more accurate to say my favorite book series of all time. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. The first on the list is the Lockwood Co series by Jonathan Stroud. The first book in the series is The Screaming Staircase, and the perfect book does exist, guys. This is literally the perfect book. When you read through it, and if you've read all of the other books in the series and you look back and you realize Jonathan Stroud knew exactly what he was doing the entire time. The way each event is plotted out, the characters, every single thing about this book right here is perfect. I honestly don't know how he does it. In this series, England has been plagued by what is called the Problem, which is ghosts who are returning to our world for some unknown reason and are plaguing people. And the only people that can see these ghosts are teenagers and children. Various agencies have risen up to try to tackle this problem, and they're run by adults, and they hire these children to go into haunted places and eradicate the ghost. The main character in the series is Lucy Carlisle, and through a series of events she comes to work for Anthony Lockwood and George Cubbins at Lockwood Co. Both Lockwood and George are teenagers like herself, and there are no adult supervisors at this agency. They're entirely independent. In the first book, The Screaming Staircase, one of their cases goes horribly wrong, and they are forced to come up with a lot of money very quickly. But their reputation is in ruins and they have no way of earning the money because the cases that they do have are being dropped. They're losing their clients. And then an offer comes their way that they simply can't really afford to refuse. And that is if they can go to Coombe Hall, which is the most haunted house in England, and clear it of its ghost infestation, their debts will be paid. But in order to do that, they have to survive the hall first, including the infamous Red Room and the titular Screaming Staircase. I don't really know what to say about this series. How do I convey how much I love these books and all of my feelings into words that make sense? The best way I can describe it, I guess, is I saw this review on Goodreads that said that this series is that person's Harry Potter, and we all know Harry Potter is very well loved. A lot of people list it as their favorite series, but this will always be my favorite series. I have not found anything that can remotely compare to it. This is the book that got me back into reading. When I picked this book up, I hadn't read for a whole year up until that point. Everything about this series is simply phenomenal. The way every event is tied together, the character development, the way it progresses throughout the series, the stakes that are presented, the atmosphere, it's very atmospheric, it's very creepy. This is the perfect fall Halloween read, and since Halloween is coming up, you should definitely give it a try. I don't read this copy because this is my signed copy. I was fortunate enough to meet Jonathan Stroud in person and he signed this copy for me.
This is my signed copy. I wanted to show you this adorable little skull drawing on the inside.
I picked this copy up at a Scholastic book fair and it's my favorite. I just love this cover so much.
This is my Scholastic copy, which I actually read, and as you can see, it is very well loved. I mean, you can see just how much I've read this book.
The banter in this book is great. I usually hate banter, but this I actually find amusing. The characters understand each other very well, but there's also misunderstandings, so they fight a lot. They just come across as very real, very individually fleshed out people. And of course it's very British, so I love it for that. The humor is right up my alley. There's wit, sarcasm, creepiness, danger. What's not to like, really? And another thing that this book does really well, and I think it's an interesting lesson, is that it's written in first-person point of view. So every scene we get is from Lucy's point of view, but it doesn't feel like it's written in first-person point of view because she makes observances about the other characters around her. She pays attention to them, what they're doing, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and because she knows them so well, it's almost like you're getting the scenes from their point of view as well because she can tell you what this character is thinking and feeling. I think first-person point of view can be dangerous because you limit yourself so much to just one character, but because Lucy pays attention and isn't focused on only herself, it doesn't feel limiting at all. Lucy is also one of the most realistic, relatable female characters I've ever come across. She's just written so well. She's not perfect, and she'd be the first to tell you that. I think a lot of teenage girls could see themselves in her. They could relate to her character because she is so down to earth. She is like a normal teenager. And that's another thing about this book that I really like, is that even though all the main characters are teenagers, they are written in a way that they are mature enough that adults can still read these books and love the characters. And they're not stupid like some YA characters are. This is technically middle grade, I think, but I would consider it YA just because someone online once remarked, how many people have to die in this book series to get to YA? I mean, you are dealing with ghosts, and in order to get a ghost, somebody has to die, so obviously people end up dead in this book series. Also, just as a side note, Netflix is developing this book series into a TV show. I think it's currently filming right now, so make sure that you read this before you watch the TV show, because it doesn't matter how good of a job Netflix does with the TV show, the book series will always be better. I'm very excited for the Netflix series, but I'm also terrified because, as I said, this is my favorite series ever, and I really want Netflix to do it justice, and I want it to be good. I want it to be faithful to the source material. I think Netflix did a really good job adapting Shadow and Bone, so it gives me faith that they'll do this right, but I'm still scared. Honestly, I could keep going on about this book and probably not make a great deal of sense. Honestly, if you read only one book recommendation that I ever make, read this one, please. It is so good. It's so underrated. I really want more people to read this series, and I think that they'll enjoy it as much as I did. It's stood the test of time. I've not found anything better than it is. It is perfect, or as close to perfect as I have ever found, and it has the best beginning sentence that I've ever come across. As soon as I read the first sentence, I knew immediately that I was going to love this book, and I have never come across that before or since. The next series on the list is the Inspector Ian Rutledge series by Charles Todd, and the first book is A Test of Wills. In this book series, Rutledge is a policeman working with Scotland Yard. I think the first book takes place in 1919, so the Great War is finally over. Rutledge was a soldier in the war, he was an officer, and he has come back with what we would consider PTSD, but back then it was called shell shock. While on the battlefield during the war, Rutledge was forced to execute a soldier under his command who refused to follow a direct order. A mortar shell fell short and exploded nearby, killing the rest of his men and burying Rutledge with the dead body of the man he had just executed. Ever since then, Rutledge has carried the voice of the dead man in his head, and Hamish, the dead man, speaks to him and they have conversations, and sometimes Hamish taunts him, sometimes he gives him warnings, sometimes he helps him figure clues out to help solve these cases. This is a very interesting concept, and I've never really encountered anything else like it. The book doesn't really explain if it's just PTSD, if the voice is all in Rutledge's own imagination, or if he's actually being haunted by Hamish's ghost, and I love the ambiguity. I love that it's never explicitly stated one way or another. In this first book in the series, a popular colonel has been murdered, and his alleged killer is a decorated war hero and a friend of the Prince of Wales. So obviously this case is a political minefield that needs to be handled very carefully. And to make matters even worse, the only witness to the crime is a shell-shocked soldier, just like Rutledge. So everyone will view this witness as a coward. How reliable can his testimony really be? Did he even see what happened? Is he making things up? And in this man, Rutledge sees a premonition or a vision of what he could become. Is he going to end up defeated and broken like this man? Which is something that's always lingering in the back of his mind. Is this shell shock going to get the better of me? Am I going to crack? Rutledge is a very interesting detective character. He is at once haunted, he is very compassionate, but he's also very passionate about justice. He's not afraid to threaten somebody who won't give him information, or if they get in his way. I love how compassionate he is to people who knew the victims, and I also appreciate how dedicated he is in his pursuit of justice. Each of these books in the series typically take place in a remote, quaint English village where some crime has been committed and the local police have called Scotland Yard in to investigate because they cannot handle the crime. These crimes are usually way more complex than they first appear, and it's beyond the means of the local constable, if there is one, to handle it, so they have to call in the specialists at the yard. There's usually some sort of danger involved. The emotions in this book are very high. Like, it will hit you in the gut with emotions because you just become so involved in these stories, and Rutledge is a character and all of the things that he's had to go through and is suffering through still. He has PTSD, he has depression, he suffers from claustrophobia because he was buried in the mud with a dead body. And there's always the risk that his superior at the yard will discover his PTSD, which back then was not at all well understood, and he would be labeled a coward. These books are very atmospheric. They explore the attitude of England post-World War I very well. There was kind of a sense of sadness all over the country because no one escaped the war unscathed. Everybody knew somebody that had died in the war. Somebody lost sons, brothers, cousins, uncles, fathers. There were a shortage of young men after the war, and there were a lot of young women who couldn't find a romantic partner because there just weren't that many left. It was a very sad time in history, and these books, as I said, they will hit you with the feels, but it's so well done, and the characterization and just the dialogue, it's just phenomenal. I have learned so much about how to write characters and dialogue and how to write well done historical mysteries from this series. The next series is also one that I have learned quite a lot from, and that is the Charlotte and Thomas Pitt series by Anne Perry. The first book in the series is The Cater Street Hangman. A lot of what I have learned about Victorian England, I have learned through these books, this series particularly, and Anne Perry. I don't know how she does it. It's like she must have been alive during that time, or she's a time traveler or something, because she just nails it so well. In the first book, we are introduced to the two main characters, Charlotte and Thomas. Thomas is a policeman, and Charlotte is a wealthy, or at least well-to-do young woman, and they are introduced because there is someone who is going around garroting young women in the area where Charlotte's family lives. So she is drawn into the investigation, and the Victorian attitude towards policemen back in the day was that they were tradesmen, they were beneath anybody who was anybody and had some money. So naturally when Thomas comes to speak to Charlotte, she doesn't like him very much. He kind of comes across as a little bit impertinent because he tells her the truth, he tells her things the way they really are. He makes her aware of the dark side of life and crime that she is shielded from because she comes from a well-to-do family. She's never known poverty. She's never known the dark, dangerous back streets of London. And by meeting Thomas, she is introduced to a whole new world that she wasn't even aware of before. And rather than turn away from it and continue to pretend that it doesn't exist, she finds herself intrigued, and slowly she's falling for this policeman. He's not going to cuddle her. He's going to treat her as an equal, and that was kind of a rare thing back in Victorian London. As the title of the series kind of hints at, they end up getting married, and the series follows them throughout their married life and Thomas's career as he works with the police and continues to solve murders. There are some truly bizarre crimes in this series. Like, I don't know how Anne Perry continues to come up with all of these creative ways to have people die, but it makes for an interesting read because you can't just have, oh, this guy got murdered. There has to be some sort of bizarre element to it. It makes it far more entertaining and complex. These mysteries are very complex. These are a bit more of a slow read, but you do have to pay attention because you could miss something. You never know what information being presented to you is important. But one of the rules of mystery is that if it's not important, it probably won't be presented to you. Of course, there are red herrings, so it's up to you as the reader to determine what you think is actually the truth. I have managed to solve a few of these mysteries, but for the most part, I was completely fooled. I was kept guessing until the very end. I love Anne Perry's writing style. It kind of flows like chocolate. Like, that's the only way I can describe it. And I thought that the very first time I read this book. Like, it's just so smooth and lyrical and also very Victorian. It's like elegant and sophisticated without being pretentious and confusing. Because if you know anything about Victorians and the way they actually wrote back then, they're kind of wordy, like to the point where you don't have to be that wordy, but these books capture the feel of that while also making it make sense. This series is also a great study in human nature. Like, by just reading these books, I have learned a lot about how to portray emotions and people's personalities in writing. In a previous video, in my historical mysteries video, I mentioned the Daniel Pitt series that Anne Perry wrote. Daniel Pitt is Thomas and Charlotte's son. That series is obviously set after this one is over. You don't have to read this one first, but I do recommend that you do it just because it's in chronological order. But you really get to know all of these characters over this series. It is quite long. You spend a lot of time with these people. You see them as they age, as they mature, they change. Things in their life happen, their careers go through changes. And when you pick up the next book, it feels like you're just going back to spend time with old friends. Between Charles Todd and Anne Perry, I have learned so much about writing, and I would not be in any way the writer that I am now without having read their books. My writing has improved so much just by reading these series, because when you have a writer that knows very much what they're doing, it shows. And the last series that I have to share with you is the Bess Crawford novels, also by Charles Todd. Bess Crawford is a nurse during World War I, and she is serving at forward aid stations spread throughout France mostly. She helps with surgery on the injured soldiers who are coming into these aid stations from the front lines, and then of course the care that comes afterward. So being a nurse, she's not your typical detective character. But there is intrigue and shenanigans going on, and she finds herself drawn into these mysteries that usually involve the army. Her father is a colonel, and he was once stationed in India, so Bess grew up in India. So the army has been a part of her life forever, basically. She's very much familiar with how the military works. She's a curious person, so naturally when something doesn't feel right, she investigates, and injustice makes her angry, so she can't just stand idly by and let people get away with things, which inevitably puts her in danger some of the time. And her father's Sergeant Major, Simon Brandon, is there to help her along the way. Simon is one of my favorite parts of this series. He is my favorite character. In the first book in the series, A Duty to the Dead, Bess is instructed by a dying lieutenant to tell his brother that he lied, that he did whatever it is for his mother's sake and that it needs to be set right. But the man's family claims that they have no idea what the message even means, and it soon becomes clear that they are harboring a dangerous secret that Bess has to get to the bottom of. Bess feels compelled to fulfill the dying man's last wish. It is her duty to the dead. They couldn't save his life, but they can deliver the message and put whatever it is that's troubling him to rights. This first book in the series, A Duty to the Dead, is actually what got me into reading historical mysteries. I think I was in high school at the time, like early high school, maybe junior high, and history just didn't interest me all that much. I kind of thought historical mysteries would be boring, so I didn't read them. I was completely committed to fantasy and fantasy only. And my dad was reading this, and he kind of challenged me to read it. He was like, you know, you don't read it, you probably will end up liking it, kind of a thing, you know, just to egg me on and get me to read it. And I was like, okay, I will read it just to see what I think of it. And I was hooked. I loved it. And I've read every book in this series since then, and it introduced me to the Ian Rutledge series, which I talked about earlier as well. It's so strange to think that if my dad hadn't challenged me to read this book, that I never would have read it. I never would have become introduced to historical mystery, and I wouldn't be writing historical mysteries now. So as far as authors that have influenced me, this has influenced me heavily. Like, I definitely would not be the writer that I am now if I hadn't read this. Both my writing and my reading would be the lesser for it if I hadn't picked this book up. Like the Rutledge series, this book also explores the effects of war, but during the war, because it's still ongoing, whereas the Rutledge books very much take place after the war. In these books, the war is still ongoing and is not over yet. This first book takes place in 1916, so there are still 2 more years of war to go. At this point, there's not really an end to the war in sight. This book series explores the consequences of war and the effects that it has on everybody. Trench warfare is ugly, and World War I was especially bad, in terms of just how gruesome it was. None of us can ever truly appreciate how bad it was, never having been there ourselves, but both this series and the Rutledge series really helps you understand just how awful it was. It's not going to be the same as if you'd been there yourself, but I think that reading these series gives you an appreciation for what these people went through in a way that nothing else could, short of having been there yourself. Before I read this book, the only exposure to World War I that I really had was reading the Leviathan trilogy, and that's steampunk fantasy, so it's not exactly completely realistic. But having read these books, I now have an appreciation of the real event itself. It sparked a love of history for me and also rekindled my love of mystery itself. So there we have it. I could go on and on about these books all day long, and I'm not sure that what I say would make much sense. It's hard to convey in words just how much I love these books and how much they mean to me, how much they've impacted my writing and influenced me. All I can do, I suppose, is try my best to convince people that these are amazing books and deserve to be read, and for everybody to just read them for themselves and decide what they think. But that is it. Those are my all-time favorite books. They stand far above anything else I've ever encountered. The characters especially are very memorable, very real. The books are not only entertaining in their own right, they also have a lot that they can teach us about what it means to write a good book. I truly believe that we learn something about writing from every book that we read, and I've learned a huge amount from these series, more than I've learned from probably everything else. That is the end of this video. If you sat through all the way to the end and dealt with all of my incoherent rambling, thank you. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to give a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content I upload every week. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!